Hello. Welcome to the North Country History Podcast. I'm Rob Burg, and this week we're talking to Bill Jamerson, who is a noted CCC historian and interpreter. He presents programs in here in the Midwest, and we're going to talk a little bit today, not so much about the programs that he does, but about one particular person, a CCC enrollee from the 1930s by the name of Michael Rataj. Now, Bill used Mike as inspiration for a project that he did, and we'll talk about that. But so we're going to get into a first-person story about being in the CCC, being one of the CCC boys in the 1930s. So sit back, settle in, and enjoy. North Country History with Rob Burg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Well, welcome, Bill. Thanks for coming in onto the podcast today.
I'm happy to be here.
So Bill Jamerson has been involved with Civilian Conservation Corps history for more than 30 years. Give you a little bit of notes here about Bill. He's a Michigan native and a alumni of the University of Michigan. But in 1992, Bill filmed a documentary film. That's redundant. But Bill filmed Camp Forgotten, the Civilian Conservation Corps in Michigan, during his time when he was a filmmaker. And this one aired on a number of PBS stations in Michigan and other locations. Along with Camp Forgotten, Bill did other historical documentaries, one on Grand Rapids furniture makers, another on Mexican farm workers, General Motors, Herbert Dow, who was the founder of Dow Chemical Company, and winter sports in Michigan. I've seen the winter sports one, Bill. That's a really good one. While his time during Camp Forgotten, he got to know many of the CCC boys, including the subject of today's talk, Mike Rataj. In 2002, Bill began performing and presenting programs on the CCC, lumberjacks, iron mine workers, and other programs at schools, libraries, and other venues. When I was working at Hartwick Pines and in charge of the CCC Museum as well, I had Bill in as a guest performer a number of times, and the crowds, the audience always enjoyed them. So his next project that he did was in 2007. Bill published Big Shoulders, a historical novel of a coming-of-age story of a teenager from Detroit who enlists in the CCC and heads to the Upper Peninsula, where he encounters hard work, a tough sergeant, and learns the importance of responsibility. This was, of course, modeled on a number of CCC boys, but in particular, Mike, as we're talking about. And Bill presents his programs throughout the upper Midwest. I know you'll be appearing in a few venues here in Michigan, including one we'll talk about at the end of the episode today. So welcome, Bill, and thanks for coming on the podcast again. And let's talk about Mike.
Great. Mike was a character. He was a dream come true for anyone that wanted to do research on the seas, because he had an iron trap memory. I guess, Rob, it might be wise for us to take a moment here and just go back to his personal background, how he, where he grew up. Mike was a Polish background, and he grew up in Hamtramck, a Polish neighborhood of Detroit. Mm-hmm. This was he was born back in 1920. And as he said, in the Depression, by the time he was a teenager, we're talking about 1934, 35, you just couldn't get a job. And the attitude of those fellows was, why is this all happening to me? There's no work. There's no money. His dad left the family, rode the rails out west to California looking for work, then never heard from him again. And I'm guessing he left in like 33, 34. The mother survived by being a waitress at a restaurant. They lived in an $11 a month apartment, he and his older brother, George. And he was, back in the mid 30s, and they were desperate. But he owned one pair of shoes, he told me. And that pair of shoes had fallen apart so bad, the leather soles separated from the leather uppers. Okay. So he taped them, he glued them. He said they still fell apart, and they flapped when he walked. And he said the kids at the high school laughed at him. And he said he dropped out of high school. It was so bad. We forget, he said a lot of guys dropped out of school because they were so threadbare. Their clothes were so awful they were embarrassed to go to school. So he's outside of a shoe store, and on the sidewalk, there's a table full of shoes for sale. And he finds a pair of size and he steals them. And he runs down the street, cuts into the alley, and there's a beat cop having a cigarette in the alley. And he's busted. And that same police officer had busted him a few months earlier for petty thievery. He was on probation, Rob, okay? And when you're on probation and you do something wrong, then you're in trouble. And he was going to go to jail, even though he was 16. That's what they did in those days. But the officer took pity on him and said, Mike, you're a good kid. You belong in the CCC. Now, the CCC, for your viewers who may not be familiar, was the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was really Roosevelt's signature work program under that umbrella of the National Recovery Act. And it employed young men between the ages of 17 and 25 years of age between 1933 and 1941. It put them in work camps run by World War I veterans. And here in Michigan, I think there were 122,000 or so. There was an average of 54 camps in operation, 200 men in every camp. And they were out in the boondocks. They were planting trees and building roads. So the idea was to put these young men to work, pay them $1 a day, $30 a month, with $25 sent home to their families each month. So these fellows had $5 a month spending money, which went a long way. You could buy a beer for a nickel and go to the movies for a dime and so forth. So anyway, getting back to the shoe story. So the police officer recommended to the judge, let this guy, join the CCCs. That's really where he belongs. He's not a bad kid. And the judge agreed and gave him a choice. You can volunteer for the C's for a year, or you can go to jail for 6 months. And Mike took it.
Yep.
And it changed his life. Yep. In fact, I know you've been to these reunions like I have. You meet these fellows in the C's, and, in the first 3 minutes that you talk to them, they always tell you the same things. How many pounds they put on, okay?
Yeah.
They tell you what camp they went to, but they always say, turned me from a boy to a man. It changed my life, turned my life around, took me off the streets. And so Mike was the quintessential CCC story in that he was really headed to, difficult times if he had not been taken off the streets and sent up to the woods.
Yes.
And so they sent him down to camp in Battle Creek. For 2 weeks of initiation for the clothing, the physicals, and the so forth, the shots, and then they put him on a train. And by the way, I wanted to give you a sense that before they sent him up to the Northwoods.
Yeah.
In my book, I tell the story how he put on his uniform and he walked to all the merchants in his neighborhood, the baker and the butcher and so forth. Yes. Goodbye, Mrs. Jones. I'm going off to the seas. Goodbye, Mr. Smith. Okay. And in my book, if I could, I'd like to just read a short excerpt.
Please do. Yes.
And the reason I wrote this book was because of these kind of stories.
Yeah.
Rob, he had an iron trap memory. He could tell you the name of everyone in his bunkhouse, 60 years later, and the name of their girlfriends, right? I mean, he had that kind of a memory. So he says now he has his uniform on. He's ready to be shipped up to camp. He says, I hiked the ferry market and said goodbye to some of the people who sold produce. My favorite vendor was Mrs. Rosenberg, a short, buxom Jewish woman who sold the best fruit in the area. The apples and pears she handled came wrapped in tissue paper and were spotless. She used to save the tissues and flatten them on the counter. After she collected a neat pile, she put them in the garbage. My brother and I stopped by on the way home from school when we were little boys, and we picked through her garbage to find those tissues. We gave them to my mother, who hung them on a nail for toilet paper. The toilet paper in our home was only for guests. When I stopped by the market, Mrs. Rosenberg was sorting through fruit. She picked up a couple apples. Nick, I'm going to miss you. Take a couple of these on your trip. Oh, you don't need to do that, I said. I just came to say goodbye. Oh, take them. You'll need them on the train. I thanked her. We chatted a few minutes about the seas, and then I said goodbye. After a few steps, I turned around. Mrs. Rosenberg, there was something I always wanted to ask you. What's that? Well, when I was a little boy, I used to go through your garbage. Well, I know, she said. Well, sometimes you threw out fruit and it was still good. What'd you do that for? She smiled. Well, I put it there for you and your brother. I know, but why? She sighed. Because you never begged like the other boys. You never begged. She came around the table and cupped my face with one of her hands. Take care of yourself, Nick. Come see me when you get back. Her loving eyes were like dark pools of pond water. Sure, Mrs. Rosenberg, I'll come back someday.
That's nice. And
he wouldn't beg, Rob. He was a good kid. So he shipped up to this camp about 70 miles northwest of St. Ignace.
mm-hmm.
It's called Camp Mackinac. And he said he couldn't sleep there for the first nights because it was so quiet. He came from the big city, right? And he said it was peaceful up there. He kept saying, it's peaceful. There was no crime, no hunger, no unemployment in the camp. We were happy, he said. He said that the woods around the camp was like a cocoon, protecting us from the outside world. And that always stayed with me. I thought that was so beautifully stated. He said his mother wrote him a letter from Hamtramck, and she wrote how the neighbor had been evicted. Another neighbor had lost his job. His best friend from high school was in jail. It was all bad news. He wrote her back and said, Mom, if you can't write anything nice, don't write at all. I don't want to hear about it. Yeah. They were happy. It was a life-changing experience for him. And, we all know the effort, the effect of being out in nature, especially if you're a troubled young man with a troubled mind. And he came into camp with a chip on his shoulder, he was on probation and he didn't know what to expect. And so it was a culture shock, to say the least. And he said the camp was full of kids from all walks of life. So you had farm boys and big city boys and small town boys. And at that point, they were segregated. It was an all white camp. In the earliest days, they were integrated. But he said you had this mix of people, and there were, bullies and softies and characters. And it was just a melting pot, he said. And the whole camp was a shock to him as far as the whole discipline aspect. Every bunkhouse had a couple pair of boxing gloves on the wall, and the bunkhouse leader would take those gloves down. If two guys were arguing and fighting and stuff, he'd say, okay, let's take it outside. They'd lace up those boxing gloves and take them outside, and they'd duke it out, and after the fight, they take off their gloves, shake hands, be friends afterwards. So there was this really a military kind of a attitude in controlling these young men. And he said it was perfect for him because it brought him under control. He was off on, they learned many jobs out there. They were chopping trees, they were repairing rivers and so forth. But he was running lines for, what's it called when you run lines again?
Survey?
Surveying, yeah. He was learning surveying. And he said it was a warm summer afternoon, and he took his shoes off and he was wandering around a little, outlet for a little pond, he said, chasing turtles and stuff. He just became totally distracted, right? And, the crew chief leader came over and said, what are you doing? You're slowing us down, and chewed him out. And back at camp, when we got back to camp, he got a royal chewing out by Mr. Morrison, who was the first sergeant of the camp, who was the boss of the camp. And Mr. Morrison gave him a punishment. And his punishment was to move a large pile of wood, probably a couple of cords, 100 yards. It was kind of a make work thing, right? Just pick up one log at a time and move this entire pile. And Mr. Morrison stood there, he said, for 2 hours with his arms folded, watching him. And he felt so guilty, He said, why is this guy standing here while I'm being punished? And when they were all done, Mr. Morrison said to him, why did you punish me? I could have been home with my wife and kids, but instead I'm standing here with you, watching you. Why do you punish me? What have I done to make you want to punish me? And Mike said he broke down and cried. He cried because it dawned on him that his whole life he'd been punishing other people with his misdeeds, whether it was just skipping school or stealing or whatever. And it just, something clicked. And he just realized it had to stop. And he said that was a turning point in his life. And he said they walked back to camp, and Mr. Morrison put his arm around him as he was crying and said, it's all right. You're going to be fine. And so these are the experiences of Mike Rataj, which basically motivated me to write a book because I used to meet him at McDonald's off the I-75 at West Branch in Roscommon. I used to visit his house over a period of 12 years from he appeared in my film in 1993 when it was released. In fact, many of the most iconic statements in the film Mike gave us, fighting a forest fire, your eyes are burning, your clothes are singed, you stink like a pig, but he was marvelous in that film.
Oh, so I remember that he leads off your film with that quote. Exactly.
Yeah. And he talks about how his brother joined the Seas. And he said, my mother was getting $50 a month. And she was making more money than the fireman next door who was getting paid in script. Okay. Yeah. Think about that. $50 a month. That's the equivalent of, times 20. That's $1,000 in today's money. Imagine that. He said, my mother had a savings account for the first time in her life. So, yeah, a lot of his great statements came from that. So, anyway, I kind of lost track of my thoughts. But so he, what was I talking about, Rob, before I got sidetracked?
Up in at Camp Mackinac and with Mr. Morrison, the sergeant.
Oh, yeah. And so it had a life-changing effect on him. But that's why I wrote the book. I said, I know. I was meeting him over a period of 12 years from 1994 to like 2006. And one day I said, I've heard enough of these stories. I'm going to write a book about you, Mike. And then I started piecing all these stories into the book. Okay. So the book is loosely based on his experiences. And I always tell people 3/4 of the book is true. And the last quarter is fiction, but it's when I wrote the book, I gave him a girlfriend, and I called her Betty. And when I gave Mike a rough draft of the book, he read it and he said, "My first wife's name was Betty. How'd you know?" And he said that how I portrayed the woman in the book was just how it worked out. You see, a CCC boy can date a local girl, take her to the movies, go to the fair, go to the lunch counter, date her for 6 months. But her parents would never let you step foot in their home. It was kind of understood that, all right, you go out with them, but they're from the wrong side of the tracks. Now, this was not always true. A lot of these fellows met their wives in the seats, but for the majority of them, there was kind of a boundary there. And Mike dated this nice girl, but there was always an understanding that, he was going to leave town without her. He wasn't going to take their prized daughter away because they weren't up to snuff. And that's how I portrayed it in the book. And he said, I nailed it. He didn't realize that. So I got to know him so intimately that when I wrote the book, it rang true with him. And the funny thing is, after I gave him the book, he read the book like 3 or 4 times. And he would reference things in the book that I wrote, which I made up, and he thought they were true. In other words, they were so real. So anyway, any other specific questions you have about him? Well, I know I'm just kind of rambling on here.
No, that's fine. No, but I don't know if I didn't mention it here so far, is that I also knew Mike. He was the historical interpreter at the CCC Museum when I started in 1998. And I don't remember what year he had to stop. He had his wife at the time, his second wife, she was in poor health, and he had to stay home to help take care of her. Needless to say, he was also getting up there in age too, so it was difficult for him to, try to work and take care of his wife. So he still came in and volunteered at times, but I heard a lot of different stories from Mike as well, and many of the same ones as you. And I'm not sure if I heard anything that you didn't hear, probably not, but it was always great that he could give the visitors to the museum a first-hand experience of what it was like to be in the CCC. That was the great thing about at that time when Mike was still alive, and all the other CCC boys, they'd come to the museum every June for the annual reunion. There was, for those who don't know, there was a Civilian Conservation Corps Alumni Association, or 2 of them, a National Alumni National Association of CCC Alumni. I think that's what it was, NACCCA.
Yes.
And then there was a Michigan CCC Alumni Association. I don't remember their acronym there, but they had then a joint reunion every year at the CCC Museum at Higgins Lake. And it was great because it was the best way to learn about the experiences of all these men. And I don't know if this one particular story, I got it from Mike, but it had to have been from another CCC boy because Mike wouldn't have been in it yet. But in 1935, when the camps became segregated, he told me this story about this one young man who he was crying when he was watching all of his African-American campmates boarding the truck to go off to a new camp. And someone asked this young man why he was crying, and he said, well, my best friend is leaving. And that was the thing, yes, it was segregated from 1935 on, but they formed strong friendships in the camps that were not segregated prior to that time. And you saw that at the reunions then, that, the African-American alumni who, many of them went to camps that were all black camps, and they had great friendships with their fellow CCC boys, regardless of their color. But Mike was able to put that in a very good personal association for visitors.
I'm sorry, but I heard that very same story. So it is a true story.
Yeah.
And you're right. When you walked into the CCC Museum back in the 90s with Mike sitting there to greet you, welcome, welcome to the C's. He would just bowl over these people with their stories, get up and walk around and point out things and talk about the bunk beds and the foot lockers and tell them these amazing stories. That reminds me when I said bunk bed and foot locker. Do you remember the story of the borrowed mom?
Thank you. I was hoping to get into that. Go ahead.
Well, it's one of his classic stories, which is well, it speaks for itself. But it was in April of 36 or 37. The men were just finishing dinner in the mess hall, and the first sergeant walks in and says, "Quiet down. I have an announcement to make. Each one of you is required to write a letter to your mother for Mother's Day. And I also want 25 cents from each one of you to purchase this pillowcase." And he held up a pillowcase that had a Mother's Day poem on it. M is for the million things she's done for me. O means only that she's growing old. T is for the tears she shed for me, so forth. It's a classic Mother's Day poem. Mm-hmm. So I need 25 cents from each one of you. Any questions? One fellow raised his hand. "Sir, can I buy my own present?" "No." The other fellow says, "Well, sir, I don't have a quarter. We'll borrow one." And then this blonde hair, toe heel fellow, Bobby Hansen, said, "Well, sir, I don't have a mother. I'm an orphan." "Well, just borrow one." And he turned to his buddy, his best friend, this Italian boy, Mario from Detroit, from Dearborn. "Can I borrow your mom?" "Sure." So Bobby wrote a letter that night. "Dear borrowed mom, happy Mother's Day. Your son is my best friend. The sergeant said I needed to borrow someone." And he wrote about himself and how he likes to play baseball with Mario. And he signed the letter, "Love your borrowed son, Bobby." Well, a few weeks later, he got a letter back. And again, Mike was there. Mike told me this story. He said, after he read the letter from his borrowed mom, he folded up the letter, put it in the envelope, held it to his chest, and leaned forward, and tears were falling off his cheeks like raindrops. He said all the guys got out of there. They grabbed their toilet kits and, made a beeline to the latrine. And Mike said a few days later, he asked Bobby, what did his borrowed mom write? And she had written, "Dear borrowed son, thank you so much for your kind letter and the nice pillowcase. It really made my Mother's Day special." She wrote about her children. And then at the end, she wrote, "Won't you please write me more about yourself? I'd love to hear more from you." And she signed the letter, "Love, your borrowed mom." And that just totally destroyed Bobby. So Mike read this letter. So anyway, Mike explains that Bobby and Mario's mother became pen pals, and they wrote letters every 3 or 4 weeks. And in time, she sent a photograph of herself. And Bobby taped that photo to the inside of his footlocker lid at the base of his cot, okay? And every night before lights out, he'd slide down his cot, lift up that footlocker lid, and place a kiss on his fingers tips, and then press that against the photograph to say goodnight to his borrowed mom. Well, this went on for 6 months or so. And then one day he got a letter, and it was addressed, "Dear borrowed son." But she crossed off the word borrowed. And she signed the letter, "Love your borrowed mom." And she crossed off that word borrowed again. Bobby didn't know what to do. He turned to Mario, and Mario says, "I don't think my mom wants to use that word anymore." And so Bobby wrote her back, "Dear borrowed mom," and he scratched off that word borrowed. And he signed the letter, "Love your borrowed son," and scratched off that word borrowed again. Well, the next letter he got from her, she asked him what he was going to do when his enlistment came up. She knew that he had been in there for a couple of years and his enlistment was coming up. Well, he wrote her back and said he was going to buy a car and drive and visit the Grand Canyon. That's what teenagers did in the 1930s. Well, she wrote him back and said, no, you're not. You're coming home. And that's what happened. Bobby Hansen, with his best friend Mario, went back to Dearborn, Michigan when his enlistment came up and began work down there. And a few weeks later, after he left, the sergeant walked into the mess hall and he said, quiet down. I got a letter from Bobby Hansen. And he read the letter to all the men. It said, dear fellows, I want to thank you for the best 2 years of my life. And I want to thank the sergeant for telling me to borrow a mom for Mother's Day. I finally got to meet my mother and my father, my grandparents, my brothers, and my sister. And I'm working as a bricklayer's apprentice. Come look me up if you're ever down here in Dearborn. All the best, Bobby. And Mike said there was not a dry eye in that mess hall. All the guys loved Bobby. He used to tell them stories about being in the orphanage and how they would line the children outside in a line, and the parents would come and pick one out. And they never picked him after 15 years. And one time they put Bobby and one other guy, and they picked the other guy. And Mike said he asked Bobby one time, how come they never picked you? You're a good-looking kid. And Bobby said he doesn't remember any of the dads having blonde hair. Nobody wanted a towhead, okay? There's this little kid with blonde hair and pale skin. No. And so they loved him. Anyway, to wrap the story up, 50 years later at a CCC reunion, Michael Rataj ran into Bobby Hansen.
Oh, fantastic.
Like in 1985, right?
Yeah.
There's Bobby with his wife. And so Michael says, Bobby, it's me, whatever happened to you? And Bobby explained that he moved in and lived with them for a few years. And then just a couple years. And then Pearl Harbor came along and he enlisted in the Navy. And he spent 4 years in the South Pacific. Mario enlisted in the Army. And so when Bobby came back from the South Pacific, Mario's younger sister, Maria, had grown from a 13-year-old teenager into a lovely 17-year-old woman. And his friendship with her turned to love. And love led to marriage.
Yeah.
And there he was at the CCC reunion in 1985. There's Bobby with Mario's younger sister, Maria. They'd been married for, 40, 50 years, whatever, raised a few kids. And so Mike asks Maria, when did you know you first loved Bobby? Because she was only 13 when they moved in. She said, from the first day I laid eyes on him. She said, I told all my girlfriends at school that he had bad hygiene, so nobody else would like him. In other words, he didn't brush his teeth. He had bad body odor. She didn't want anyone else to get her hands on him. And these are just beautiful stories that Mike recalls just so intimately. And it's just such a privilege to hear these stories because it's a chapter of our history, which is really not talked about.
No.
The regenerative effect of the seas on these young men.
No.
And being in this atmosphere, working in the woods, working on the farms, planting trees, and just a life-changing experience.
Yeah. And
any other aspect? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, and also, you mentioned there in his first night at the camp of how hard it was for him to sleep. But there had to have been a huge culture shock for these city kids, not just from Detroit, but from Grand Rapids, Flint, Jackson, all these other industrial towns here in southern Michigan that went up to the woods for Mike in the Upper Peninsula, but others, that went to Camp Hartwick Pines or to the Higgins Lake to work at the nursery, that it was a total different world than what they were familiar with.
And not only that, we have to remember these fellows, when they came into camp, they issued them new clothing, work boots, dungarees, and the work clothes, but also dress, khaki uniforms in summer, olive drab in winter, dress shoes, scarves, mittens, caps, coats. They had decent clothing.
Yeah.
And so it gave them some self-esteem. So they had $5 a month. They could go into town for the first time in their life. They had a little self-esteem. And it made them feel good about themselves because a lot of them were just, they'd been living the last few years in threadbare clothing, and they would throw the old clothing out. I met a fellow in Georgia. He said when he went into the seas, he said every fellow on that bus was barefoot. Imagine a busload of barefoot teenagers coming into work camp being issued socks and shoes and boots. So Mike said that, when he left camp, he had 2 suits and dress shoes and new clothing. And he was, 20, 25 pounds heavier as well.
Yeah.
But these fellows came in, they were skinny. The reason Mike was on probation was stealing food. He stole like a canned ham or something. Okay. These fellows, when you're hungry, Rob, you'll do things, you'll steal.
Yep.
And so a lot of these fellows, for the first time, they got 3 square meals. They show up at breakfast, pancakes, chipped beef on toast, scrambled eggs with chunks of sausage, bacon, ham. They had never seen this kind of food before. So it put weight on them. It put new clothing on them. It gave them a work ethic. It taught them how to work. It's one thing to have a skill to go out and chop trees, right?
Yeah.
But it's another thing to go out and chop trees when it's 20 below zero for 8 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That doesn't come easily.
No.
And by the way, they had a rule in camp. You didn't have to work if it was 20 below. But a lot of fellows told me how the thermometers were rigged. Okay. They never got a day off in the winter.
Yeah.
And in the video, Johnny Johnson talks about how they would be out working in the morning. They'd have to work for 2 hours before they had a fire to warm up. Imagine that. You're working from 7:30 to 8, 9:30, and then finally, we got a break. We can go stand by the fire. So these are the things that changed his life, and why he had such a depth of gratitude. And I think his working at the CCC Museum for all those years as a volunteer was his giving back to the seas, what it gave to him. And, he was involved in Knights of Columbus for many years, just doing all kinds of things for young people. He had such a heart, giving heart. And even to his last days, caring for his wife, she made him promise that he would not leave her. And he gave up so much to care for her in her last days.
Yes.
So his whole life was a testament to the rejuvenating effect of the seas. And, but it's the stories. A story just popped in my head. He walked into the bunkhouse, and there's this fellow named Jose, Mexican-American, sitting on a cot, and he's crying. Rob, he's crying. There's a letter next to him from home. And Mike says, well, what are you crying for? And Jose says, moves his head. You can pick up the letter and read it. So he picks up the letter, and I just picked up my book here. Dear Jose, we're so proud of you and the fine job you're doing. Your last paycheck bought us lots of good food like beans, cornmeal, and sugar. The pantry's so full you wouldn't recognize it. Mama spends a lot of time in the kitchen singing. She's so happy. There was enough money left over from your last check to buy your sister a new Easter dress, a pair of shoes, and an Easter bonnet. I wish you could have seen how pretty she looked at church. We thought of you that day. Anyway, I'm going to skip ahead here. So Mike says, he says, I know why you're unhappy. You wish you could have seen your sister in that Easter dress. And Jose shakes his head no. I know what it is. there wasn't enough money for your parents to buy anything nice for themselves. And Jose nods yes. You see, Jose wanted his parents to buy something for themselves and not just give it to the siblings, okay? And this happened to Mike. Mike picked up the guy's letter. I mean, and he could recall the letter to me and dictate the letter. That's why this is such an extraordinary individual, you know. But or the time they were shaping stones, they were working with Mr. Koski, a Finnish stonemason. Okay, and one of the fellows chipped. It's called facing the stone, and handed the stone to Mr. Koski. He was building a chimney. It's perfect, Mr. Koski. Mr. Koski takes the stone, taps it very lightly with a hammer. No, it's perfect. It's not perfect till I say it's perfect. These are the stories that Mike has shared with us, which has made it into my CD of songs and my book and my film. And he really, if there was one individual who changed my life and my career track, it was Michael Rataj. Because if there was no Michael there, I don't know if I would have made that film, because he was the inspiration for so many aspects of that film. And then he inspired me to write these songs. Should I grab my guitar? I want to play a couple things for you real quick.
Sure.
Are we on time?
No.
Okay. How's our time?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I wasn't
guitar.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on doing this. I hope my guitar is tuned okay. But
I won't be able to tell.
But one of the songs that people just love when I go on my tours, he was only 16, he stole a pair of shoes. Officer said, boy, you've got to choose between a life of crime and doing the right thing. The judge looked down upon his face, said, we got to get you out of this place. It's time for a new start in the CCC. Yeah, that's an example of a song that Mike inspired me. Mm-hmm. And he inspired my first songs, and those led to other songs. And I have a double CD with 17 songs on it. And that's because of Mike, okay? And Mike, of course, was the inspiration for my book. He told me so many stories. I said, Mike, I've got to write a book about your life. So he had a profound effect on my life, not just in introducing me to the season and the opportunities, but it motivated me, because his depth of gratitude and the effect it had on his life was an inspiration to me that made me want to go out and travel and tell these stories. And Rob, you know what it's like when you have people come up to you after a program and they say, now I finally know what formed my husband. Now I know why my dad was the way he was. Thank you. And it's because of Mike. Because Mike not only had these incredible stories, but he had this iron trap memory, so he could just recall them in such detail that they became more real to people. And I wrote a song about Mr. Morrison, punishing him, which was based on his life. I'm just thinking about the other songs here. I'm just going to pick up my double CD and sing how many songs are based on him. It's tough to be a rookie. Teacher. He told me the story of how this fellow was. They were working side by side in the woods, and this fellow was verbally going over his English lesson as he was working. And Mike said, what are you doing? He says, I'm just going over my homework. He says, for the first time in my life, I realized what learning's all about. He said, I never wanted to learn before. So that story that Mike gave me, I turned into a song called Teacher. I wrote a song, Tree Planting Firefighting Blues, based on Mike's story about fighting forest fires. You know, Um, you take, it's kind of a Johnny Cash. Well, when you join the CCCs, one of your jobs is planting trees. If that's not the kind of work you desire, you can take a shovel and fight forest fires. They drive us to some barren land. They give us seedlings to plant by hand. You stick a spud bar in the ground, pull it back to make a hole that's round. So I go through the whole process of planting trees and fighting forest fire. That's all Mike. Yeah, on that. And Mike became best friends with a fellow, and with Mario, in fact. And one reason was they're planting trees out in the woods. Mario was kind of cutting corners, and Mike warned him, "Don't do that because you're going to get caught," and basically saved him, gave him a heads up on it. Chow Time was a song I wrote based on Mike's stories about eating food. Mike told me the story how a farmer called the CCC camp and reported that a truck had hit one of his cows and splattered it across the highway. And if the CCC camp wanted the meat, they could have it. So Mike was one of the guys who went out there and scooped this meat off the ground, little pieces of this deer carcass, right? I'm sorry, cow carcass. And he told me the story. I made a song out of it. Yeah. Okay. Then I wrote a song called Mr. Morrison. I wrote a song called Borrowed Mom, as I recalled that story to you. And then I wrote a song called Saturday Night, Going Into Town. You know, it only happens once a week, but oh, that feeling is so sweet. It's Saturday night, we're going on the town. I planted about 10,000 trees. I did it all on bended knees. Now we're on the road and pleasure bound. So I go through this song about meeting girls and dancing. That's Mike. He told me for the first time he was out there having confidence. You could buy a dance for a nickel at these local dance clubs. And so these songs were the foundation of my songs, my book, my film. And so he touched me in many ways, and he touched hundreds of people who came in to that CCC Museum in Roscommon, which if your listeners haven't seen, it's a real jewel. It's a real gem.
Yeah, no, that's, yeah, I want to pitch that here as we're talking. Is that the CCC Museum, and there'll be links for the museum. There has been in other episodes. I've visited there a couple times, and that it's open. I believe it just opened for the season here, Memorial Day weekend, and will be open up at least through Labor Day. And I don't remember the exact hours offhand, but I'll have the link on the podcast notes, along with the link to your website, Bill, billjamerson.com. And I'll have that all spelled out on there so people can see where they can find out more about you, your programs, where you're performing at, and also so they can see about buying Camp Forgotten, Big Shoulders, your CD. I recommend all three of them. I haven't watched the film or read the book lately, but I will have to do that again very soon. But I do have your CD, and I listened to it a couple of weeks ago just to kind of get back prepped and onto the website or the podcast here. But yes, sir.
I was going to just add, if they don't buy the book or CD or film, they're in most of the Michigan libraries. So they can go to their local library. And if you'd like me to visit your community, please give your librarian, your historical society, your school principal, my name and my website, and I'll come to your town. I pretty much limit myself to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota right now. I don't travel as far as I used to.
Well, so, that's perfect, because that's the area of the podcast is Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So,
and if, by the way, if you have listeners in Wisconsin, There's a wonderful book by Jerry Apps, APPS. This gentleman has written many books on history. It's called The Civilian Conservation Corps in Wisconsin. It's a real treasure, and I would recommend that book as well. And for those living in Minnesota, Barbara Summers, Sommers, wrote a wonderful book, Hard Work, Good Deal. Hard Work, Good Deal, which is the definitive book on the seas in Minnesota.
All right. Yes, I will have information for various books here. I've got several books that I recommend as well for people to read to learn more about the seas. But one last thing I want to mention, and there's so many things I could have talked to you about to add more, but we're running out of time. But speaking of going back to the CCC Museum in August, there's an event at the museum that I know that you're going to be there as one of the guests. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, you'll want to come out to the museum and the nursery at Higgins Lake on Saturday, August 2nd. And if you visit their website, they'll have the schedule. But I'll be performing, singing songs, and telling stories. Phil Nod will be there with his CCC boys, and they have a tent and lots of tools, equipment, and lots of great stories to tell. And it's just a wonderful day-long event at the Higgins Lake Nursery and CCC Museum. Remember, the Seas had a tremendous nursery over there. And this is a great opportunity to bring young people and children to learn about the role of nurseries and the reforestation efforts in Michigan.
Yeah, it's a great event. As you remember, Bill, I was up there last summer for the event, and unfortunately, I have other plans happening this year. I will be on my annual vacation from my day job, but it will be my podcast tour, and I will be in Michigan still, but I'll be up at Pigeon River that weekend and working on a podcast episode about the Pigeon River Country State Forest. And I'll be looking at CCC work that they did up there as well. But one of my stops for that vacation when I get to Minnesota will be Gooseberry Falls State Park up north of Duluth. And I don't know if you've been there, but they did fantastic work constructing that state park and using all this fantastic fieldstone work that they did, stonemasonry. It's a beautiful place. I saw it several years ago, 20 years ago now. So it'll be my chance to get back and camp there at the park this time.
Yeah, you will love your visit there again. The castle wall, these 2,000-pound blocks, they use block and tackle to haul those stones up. It's incredible. And also what's interesting is they have a CCC camp there, the old restoration, an archaeological dig.
Oh,
so you
great.
can actually visit the old grounds
yeah. So, one last thing I want to ask you. It is something that I'm trying to incorporate with everybody who comes onto the podcast. And I want to ask you a question about forests. Because without forests, this whole podcast would not exist. It's a podcast on forest history. And we all kind of have our own feelings about what it's like to be out in the woods. And, for it be a historical reasoning, you and I as historians, or for people just want to enjoy the trees. So the thing I ask everybody is, what do forests make you feel, or how do they make you feel? A forest when you're in
It's a wonderful question. To me, forests is a portal into the sacred. When you're in a forest, you're in a holy place. A tree, of course, the tree of life has many spiritual ramifications. Jesus refers to it, I'm the branch, ye are the vine. I'm the vine, you are the branch. But the tree stands complete. It's rooted in the ground. It reaches to the heavens. And when you have a conglomeration of these trees called a forest, it becomes a holy place, and it stills the mind. It's difficult to be depressed. It's difficult to be angry when you're in the woods. Think about that. Whatever troubles you have, whatever ails you, go into the woods. John Burroughs talks about this, all the great mystics. Go into the woods, and it just calms you down. So to me, the woods is a portal into the sacred. It leads us into our original self, our quietness. We get so troubled, and as personified by Mike, coming from the big city, you go into the woods, it has a calming effect, and it's there for a purpose. And it meets your need. Whatever your need is, it will meet it. If you're unhappy, angry, it's it's wonderful environment to be in. When you go into the woods, you stand on holy ground. That's the only way I could put it. And it's a place where more people need to spend more time. And thank you for the time and directing people to this.
Yeah, thank you. Or you're welcome, but thank you for coming on again. And yeah, it's always great to be able to reconnect with people like yourself who, geez, I've known you since 1998. I met you at my very first CCC reunion in 1998 when I started at Hartwick Pines and Higgins Lake at the nursery or at the CCC Museum. And it's great that here 27 years later, we're still colleagues and friends, and that we can continue to share our stories, our history, or our information with others. And so thank you again for coming on. And I regret that I can't make it to the event at the Nursery and CCC Museum in August, because it would be great to visit with you in person again, instead of on Zoom. By the way, for people who don't know, Bill is joining us from Ironwood at the very western edge of the Upper Peninsula today. And I'm down in Chelsea outside of Ann Arbor. So, geez, we're only about 10 hours away by car. So, but it's great to have this way that we can connect, because otherwise, would have had to make that detour to Roscommon in August, and I don't want to wait that long. So, so thank you again for coming out, Bill. And yes, everybody, to please check the Bill's website, and again, that's Bill Jamerson, BILLJAMERSON.com. For more information about Bill's programs, where he's going to be performing at. Maybe he's in your area. You can check out some of the work that he's done. There's just a lot of great information. He does programs not just on the CCC, but as I mentioned about the lumberjacks, iron mine workers, and he does other programs as well, besides
and ski jumpers is a very popular
jumpers,
one.
yes, and that was one of them. I loved that one, and I remember when I was at the at Hartwick Pines, our park manager at the time, he was from John Gregorich. He was a UP native, and we watched we had the VHS version of your winter sports show, and that just brought back a lot of great memories for John too, and watching the ski jumping and some of the other stuff there. And it's for Youpers, it's great for having not been a Youper yourself originally. You really brought that history alive for all those folks and for everybody who sees your programs or have seen your films, read your book. So thank you again for coming out. And next week, we're going to be turning a little bit from CCC history, which the last two, and we're going to get into some of the history of logging in other parts of the country that predated Michigan and the Great Lakes region. We're going to the Northeast next week with Maine, the birth of the lumber industry. And after that, the Adirondacks in New York State, and then Penn's Woods in Pennsylvania. So we'll do that for the next 3 episodes, and then we'll be getting back to more Great Lakes-oriented episodes. So thank you again for joining me, Bill. And
my pleasure.
So we will be talking again here on the podcast. I don't know when I'll have you as a guest again, but it'll definitely happen again. So, and thank you everybody for listening in today. And stay tuned next week for another episode of North Country History with Rob Burg, where I will be your guide to forest history of the Great Lakes. North Country History with Rob Burg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Burg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Burg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Burg, Environmental Historian.